The term robot comes from literature. The Czech author Karel Čapek used it in his play Rossum Universal Robots, 1920, while cyberspace was coined by cyberpunk writer William Gibson in his novelette Burning Chrome, 1982. Do you consider science fiction as a source of inspiration for science? Did you get any ideas from books or movies which you've developed in your scientific work?
With science fiction, there are different aspects. There's some of the more obvious robot-y, artificial intelligence stories, the Rossum's Universal Robots for Čapek and The Matrix and The Terminator, those sort of things. But there are also stories like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I'm actually sitting in my office in Reading on the River Thames, very beautiful city if you haven't been here. Just down the river, if you just get in a boat and float down the river towards London, you come to Marlow, doesn't take long, and in Marlow that's where Mary Shelley wrote the book Frankenstein. So where I am now is just 10 miles down the river from where Frankenstein was written, which is quite exciting, isn't it, really? And there, of course, it's a human brain appearing in a different human body of parts and so on. And you think, well, what would the brain feel like? It would probably be traumatic if suddenly your brain is in a different body. How does it sense things a little differently than it did originally? But it's still a human body, so maybe it's not too dramatic, not too different. I think for me, much more exciting of the same genre is Kafka's Metamorphosis. I mean, this to me is, Metamorphosis is one of the best science fiction stories ever written, because Gregor, the main character, he's a regular guy doing his own thing. He goes to bed one night, he wakes up, and his body has been transformed into that of a bug. He is now a bug. He has 12 legs, he has a bug body, he has bug senses, and he has to move like it's awkward to get out of bed when you've got 12 legs. How does he do it? He has to learn to coordinate and so on. I mean, I have to admit it would be a pretty awful thing if you think about it to happen. You suddenly wake. So when you go to sleep tonight, worry about it, because it really would be a problem. How does his brain cope? It would be extremely traumatic. How would it deal with learning? But also, how does everybody else deal and interact with this new Gregor? And first of all, they're not sure, and then gradually they perhaps ostracize him. I mean, who the hell wants to talk to a bug? Let's face it. It gets more and more difficult for the guy. It's not a happy ending, I have to say, and that's probably more of a realistic, futuristic scenario for many things like that. I think the same ilk we get, again, inspirational, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Robert Louis Stevenson, wonderful, wonderful story, because you have Dr. Jekyll carrying out experimentation. He believes, his hypothesis for the future is if he takes certain chemicals, if he drinks them, it is going to make his brain much more powerful. Wow, how? Now, we know what happens in the story, that he becomes Mr. Hyde, he becomes a murderer and so on. It has all sorts of negative effects. So we look back and say, well, this is a horror story. Well, it's a science fiction story, because you have to ask the question now. You don't know what the ending is. You are Dr. Jekyll in your laboratory. You have the hypothesis that if you drink this chemical, you are going to be super intelligent and so on. Would you drink the chemical? And this is an important question now. Would you do it? Because when you're watching the film and you see Dr. Jekyll, you think, no, don't drink it, it's going to do horrible things to you, because we know what's going to happen. But in reality, of course, if you were Dr. Jekyll, you would drink the potion. You want to be super intelligent or whatever it is. Of course, you would have the implant put into your brain or nervous system or whatever it is. That's what you do. You're a scientist, you're a researcher, you're an experimenter, you are excited by it. This is what you live for, this is what you breathe for, is to do that. For Dr. Jekyll, this was the culmination of his life's work, was to drink the chemical, which he did do. And he drank it again, and he drank, and it transformed him, and in the end it didn't turn out very nice. And this is what happened. In the world of self-experimenters, which is what Dr. Jekyll was in a fictional sense, and what I am in a scientific sense, things go wrong sometimes, and you don't know. That's what you're doing the experiment for, is to find out. You hope your hypothesis is right, and it will work, and the history is littered with people in which the hypothesis has been correct, and they've been lauded for what they've done. Similarly, history is littered with scientists where it hasn't actually been correct, and it's gone horribly wrong, and they've taken a chemical, pharmaceutical, whatever, and they're dead within a few days. It's been poisoned or whatever. There are many examples of that. Dr. Jekyll would have drunk the potion. If you were in Dr. Jekyll's shoes, you would drink the potion, because that's what your life is all about. So science fiction has all sorts of stories, morals to tell us, and I think and hope will forever. I was at a meeting in Easter 2010 in Egypt called Biovisions, and we were asked, myself and a number of other speakers, had science fiction affected how we think about things. One of the speakers, Miguel Nicolelis, excellent researcher, was not prepared to answer the question, wasn't prepared to even consider the possibilities that science fiction could or would or will influence his work. Certainly wasn't willing to say anything about it, which I found very, very disappointing. I've found science fiction in my life very influential, gives me ideas constantly, but also gives some aspect of philosophical argument and understanding to a particular technological development that you're trying to make. If we look at one of the inspirations, Karel Čapek and his Rossum's universal robot. Rossum in Czech actually means sort of knowledge. You say, rozumíš, do you understand? And robot, of course, comes from work. It's the same, it's a Slav word, so it appears in Polish, all sorts of things, but robot meant originally something like a human slave worker in agriculture, in the fields, doing a fairly repetitive task. So the whole concept, Rossum's universal robots, is putting intelligence in the name of the guy. I mean, you think of Rossum just as the professor, but it's actually knowledge in there into the robot. So Čapek was way ahead of his time thinking about that. And it does offer up questions in terms of artificial intelligence, intelligence in robots. In the story there, I think the robots, a bit like in AI, the film, want to have human emotions, and but they do rebel, a bit like iRobot, Asimov's stories, potentially to threaten humanity. And then we're into the Terminator scenario, where the robot, the machines, in a network, which has now more recently appeared. I think earlier science fiction writers didn't foresee the power of the network, whereas in things like Terminator, it's there, and the power is important in connecting up to the what can be fairly low intelligence machines. You know, Arnold Schwarzenegger, let's face it. The Matrix goes even further, looks at the intelligent network to which the human brain is plugged in. So clearly all of these things have a strong influence on my work to look at what the possibilities are. The implant that I had, the Utah Array BrainGate, is really just a mini matrix. It's exactly what Keanu Reeves had, the big thing in the back of his head. I had just a smaller version in my nervous system. It's the same thing that John Donoghue has put in Matt Nagel and other patients. I know Andy Schwartz is working on it with monkeys, and I think from what he said, humans shortly. So it's a mini matrix, essentially. Bidirectional, you can send signals into the brain, the nervous system with that, and pull signals out. One of my big inspirations from the work I've done in the area came from a a Michael Crichton story called The Terminal Man. When I was in my teens, I read the story. This is about a psychopathic killer who has electrodes put in his brain, and then they try to stimulate the brain. So when he is about to kill somebody, he gets pleasurable feelings in his brain, the idea being that he wouldn't then go and kill people. The problem is, he tries to kill somebody, he gets pleasurable feelings, makes him want to kill even more people. I've spoilt the story for everybody, but that's about the size of it. But I read it more as a science story, and when I had my own implant in 2002 in my nervous system, I read again Crichton's chapter on the implantation, and it was amazing, the overlap in the hospital, the operating theatre, what actually happened, the procedures, how long it took, and so on. So many similarities. It was unbelievable. So I think science fiction can not only accurately represent potential future scenarios, both positive and negative, it can certainly give ideas to scientists, both positive and negative. It can raise philosophical questions for all of us, not just for scientists, to see, could we get into a problem here? Is there opportunities, commercial opportunities here, and so on. So I think science fiction is there. It's for us not to throw away, but to make use of. As a scientist, really you are a mini science fiction writer, because what you're doing, you make a hypothesis. I think this is possible. This equation is possible. This if I do this, this will happen. That's what research is all about. And then you go and carry out experimentation to prove the hypothesis, or maybe modify it slightly. That's what you're doing. You are speculating 1 year, 2 years, maybe 10 years out, and saying, I believe this is possible, and then you do the experimentation to show, look, scientifically I've shown that it's possible, and now I've proved in some way, because you never actually completely prove that it is, but you've proved for scientific debate and evidence that it is for the moment. So we are in fact science fiction. The only difference is somebody who's writing the fiction, you hope, is writing sort of 10, 20, 30 years into the future, whereas you are looking maybe 1 year or 10 years with a much more perhaps heavy scientific bent. But there's clearly overlap there. I think speculating with intelligence particularly, maybe scientists are looking more 15, 20 years out, and some science fiction writers, let's face it, they can be pretty boring, and maybe they're only looking a few years. It's already happened, the technology in some cases, when the story comes out. So I think of one example, I don't know whether you call it science fiction, James Bond in Casino Royale. He has an implant fitted, and it's the type of implant that we've been working on for the last 12, 13 years. Eventually, James Bond gets it. I mean, he could have had the thing 10 years earlier. So that was a case where science really went ahead of, in this case, fiction, I guess. I don't know whether James Bond is science fiction. HAL is an example, an inspiration from Arthur C. Clarke, 2001. We certainly didn't have a HAL by 2001. This is a machine that had a sort of a human consciousness and so on. But we had machines with networks and intellectual abilities in different ways. I don't think we actually wanted or needed a HAL, a replacement human. We use computers, machines, technology, intelligence in the military domain, in the financial sector, for different things. But it was interesting to speculate that there would be something like HAL. There may be in time, but the sort of time scale for 2001, I think it suited the film, but it was far too quick for, as a society. I mean, it may have been right, though. A different society, different pressures, we might have gone for it, but as it turns out, we haven't. It might be another 20, 30 years or longer before we have anything like HAL. We may never actually want anything like HAL, simply because it doesn't fit. It will be HAL which will decide whether it wants us, ultimately.